Yes, everybody. New podcast today. And today I'm delighted to share with you that I have my good friend Tim Anderson come along. Me and Tim, we met 5 years ago at the Vipassana. Vipassana is a meditation retreat. It's hosted all over the world. It's a 10-day silent retreat, actually. And we met, or we connected properly after we've completed the 10 days. And since then, we've been jamming, we've been connecting on very deep levels, and Tim has become one of my best friends. He works as a counselor, and he is also, yeah, very much a healer in his being. My experience of him is always super open minded, witty, and just a good bloke. Very good friend. Very good friend. So, like I said, I'm delighted to bring him on today. And the intention for our conversation today is to share some insights and knowledge around childhood, trauma, maybe addiction and emotional processing, which will empower us. When we have this knowledge, it will empower us to live more fully, to let go and shed the patterns and the restrictions that are no longer serving us, and to truly blossom. Because the conditioning that we accumulate and the patterns we accumulate in childhood, and also the wounds that sinks into our being in our childhood, they really need to be resolved and looked at in order for them to stop limiting our expression and defining our existence. So I wanted to invite Tim to share a little bit about the work that he does, and what his insights has been around this after having worked now for some time, both with adults and with children, and is now currently working full time as a counselor in England, around Bristol.
Cheers, Wazee. Thanks for the kind words. So yeah, I've been a counsellor now for a couple of years. I actually studied counselling children and young people, which was very interesting. But yeah, I realised after some time that I would prefer working with adults. So I've translated kind of the theory and the experiences I've had with children and young people into my work with adults. Yeah, which at the start took a little bit of adjustment, but I'm finding now it's really, yeah, it's really useful to have that grounding in understanding like the root of the behaviors of adults, and not seeing behaviors just on the surface level, but trying to track them back as to what originally kind of prompted these behaviors. So yeah, I think the kind of theories or the modalities that I work with, modality I mainly work with is called systemic, which differs from more behavioral understandings of psychology, like, something like cognitive behavioral therapy. They'll look at someone's behavior and look at it at the surface level, like what are they doing, and maybe view that behavior as maladaptive and say, okay, this behavior isn't serving them, it's antisocial, um, therefore they've got this disorder or this disorder or this disorder. Whereas systemic kind of understanding looks at behavior as part of a wider system. So an example of that would be, yeah, would be something like a child. If you saw a child at school and they were like stealing food, for example, and every time they got called up about it, they would get like a violent and get aggressive. Someone who understood that just from a behavioral perspective would say, okay, this kid's got behavioral issues. Maybe they've got, some kind of disorder, oppositional defiant disorder or something like that. Whereas a systemic kind of practitioner would look at it and say, okay, what function does this behavior serve? What's going on in the wider system that leads to this behavior being prominent? And from your investigation, you might learn that the that the child has quite an abusive home life, that maybe their parents are drug addicts, maybe they don't have access to to food that they always need. So when they seafood, they just stuff it in their face as soon as they can, you know, because they know that it might not be available the next day. And if they had older siblings, for example, that try and steal their food,
Mm.
then when they got that food, they would have to fight to keep it, you know? So what would seem on one level to be maladaptive behavior is actually adaptive and helps their survival. So if you don't understand that, yeah, you're going to be missing a whole big part of the puzzle.
Mm.
And you're going to possibly get a kid on some kind of medication thinking that they've got something wrong with them when actually they've just adapted to try and survive, you know.
Mm.
And you know, the behaviors that are formed in childhood, if they're not addressed, can then follow on to adulthood.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's just one example.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. What was coming up to me, up for me as I was speaking, or as you were speaking, plugging into my own experiences. For a long time, I looked back at my childhood as if it was, it was a happy childhood, it was a good childhood, and I didn't conceive or consider it in depth, but I had like this overarching sense. I had a good childhood, playing football, having friends, going to school. But when I started to look into it, I did realize there was quite a lot of holes in my childhood, and quite a lot of pain and hurt, and feeling that I had to really adapt to my parents, to my environment in ways that wasn't natural or wasn't authentic to who I am. And by doing that, I actually started to judge myself and started to, you could say, reject parts of myself that wasn't welcomed by my parents, that wasn't bringing me or giving me what I needed at the time. So, my focus went in on always trying to prove myself to my father in particular, and also wanting to attend to my mother for her to accept me and embrace me and basically give me love. This
Mm,
is something, in my work around this, as a mentor, and also having dived deeply into my own patterns and studying this for a long time now, I realized one of the key components to a healthy and good childhood is unconditional love
mm,
and unconditional positive regard. That there is, of course, boundaries, that there are boundaries, but it's so crucial that the child is met emotionally, that they're seen, that they're
mm,
heard, that they're held, that they're welcomed, and then that they're allowed to fail. And this, of course, is quite a complex matter in some ways, because a childhood and a life is such a big thing. So I felt that weaved into what you were sharing about, yeah, childhood and that development. What is your take on that, my friend?
yeah, I think when I think we all, to some degree, don't experience unconditional acceptance and unconditional love. You know, we all experience to some degree, like you get rewarded or good feedback if you do certain behaviors, and if you do other behaviors, you get criticized or judged, and you feel that judgment, especially when you're very sensitive as a kid, you know, especially the first 6 years of life, feeling that judgment makes you feel ashamed, you know, makes you feel somehow deficient, maybe lacking, maybe unworthy of love. And that's how the kind of underlying belief forms that we're not enough, you know.
Yeah.
So people that have this kind of inner critic, this inner judge that says things like you're not enough, you're
Mm-hmm.
worthless, you're stupid, you're this, you're that, this inner voice is not just, is always not you, it's not your voice, it's almost like mirroring the feedback you've received from your parents or from some other kind of authority figures throughout the years that's
Mm-hmm.
been internalized. And the
Yeah.
problem is into adulthood is we identify with these thoughts as fact, as truth,
Yeah.
and we hold that feeling of shame, that feeling of lack, which is so um, insidious
Mm.
because it's so inherently linked to our sense of self and our
Yeah.
sense of identity. And this feeling of shame, lack, can lead to either kind of wallowing in it and just feeling worthless. And the ultimate, I believe the ultimate end result, if you get too lost in that feeling of shame, is you want to end your life
For
because you
real.
feel so worthless, so meaningless, that you're just like,
Mm,
what is the point? I'd be
yeah.
better off gone. I'm caught, I'm letting people down, I'm letting myself down.
Mm,
Shit, the problem is people believe this inner noise, they believe this feeling,
mm,
and they can't see that it's just it's just a temporary emotional experience
mm,
brought on by certain conditions and
mm,
certain feedback. Like, it is not you, it doesn't define you. And this is something I say to almost, like, I've learned to say to almost all of my clients, to try and detach them from the difference between the shame and the feeling and truth,
mm.
because it's not true. You are not deficient, you just feel like you are.
And perceive that you are and believe that you are.
Yeah.
There's a lot of powerful points you come up with there. And, the sense of lack, the sense of meaninglessness and deficiency, I believe we all can relate to. Everyone who's listening to this podcast, everyone on planet Earth, in fact, at some point have been in touch with a feeling and a perception of deficiency, because that inadequacy of holding in childhood as we grow up, which is inevitable because no childhood is perfect. And I think it's actually a natural evolutionary process to get disconnected. And when we get disconnected, we do feel deficient, and there is a hole or a sense of lack that comes into place. How deeply embedded this lack belief is, the belief that I am incomplete, is embedded in the human psyche, in our consciousness, I guess depends from individual to individual, and how dense it is, you could say, but it's something
Mm.
we all can relate to. And there are powerful ways, and ways that we can go beyond that, that we can overcome that feeling and really gain a true and deep and thorough experiential understanding of our true self. And this is where the true self comes into the frame, which is a word used quite a lot nowadays, pointing to the true self. What is the true self? And you were speaking to it now, saying the emotions that comes up in us, that arise in us, the thoughts that arise in us, the inner critic that is constantly judging ourselves and others, they do not define our being. They are not our identity. We have attached an identity to them, and we perceive that it reflects us, that we are interlinked and one with the thought in terms of our identity. But as we do the inner work and we begin to wake up to who we truly are, we see that that's not the case.
Mm. I think what's coming up for me is the importance of, like, understanding trauma ultimately, because most of us understand trauma as something that only war veterans experience, or only people that have experienced, like, domestic violence and that type of thing. But trauma, I believe, is a universal human experience, especially something like emotional abuse or emotional neglect, which often people don't mean. Of course, parents, for example, they're just doing what they think is best, but it's so easy to experience emotional abuse, just like, being really mean, saying something like, yeah, just telling someone off for something, harshly, or, making a kid feel ashamed or guilty, that can be a traumatizing experience for a child,
And particularly when it's consistent over a longer period of
Mm.
time, again and again. Go on.
Definitely. So I think the thing that happens with trauma is a kind of a disconnection. There's a part of the psyche that kind of splits off almost to, like, contain that emotional pain. Because if you were carrying that emotional pain around with you all the time, you wouldn't be able to function in society. So there's somewhat of a, like, when you experience trauma, whether that's something extreme like rape or war, or whether that's something not so obvious like emotional neglect or emotional abuse, There's
Another
somewhat.
example, if I may come in, is like
Sure, sure.
divorce can be a big one for children, being
Mm, oh yeah.
being bullied, or
Mm,
having illness in the family, even like that you have a mother that is depressed, a
yeah,
father
yeah.
that is ill, or that your parents are in constant conflict, arguing. So
Mm,
there can be
mm,
small like that from the outside seems like small things, like this is normal for everybody, but for a child, man, that is traumatizing.
definitely. And with the disconnect that comes, um, it kind of gives an insight into what needs to be done to heal and to grow and to overcome trauma and the post-traumatic stress that results from it. So I guess the opposite of disconnection is integration or reintegration. And that is one of the chief kind of goals of therapy and in healing from trauma, is to reintegrate those fractured parts of the psyche, to kind of form a coherent whole.
Yeah.
um, and there's various different ways to do that. Actually a lot more education about trauma now and a lot more awareness about it, but it's still surprisingly not very widely acknowledged in the kind of in the psychiatric or
Yeah.
the community of psychologists, because they're much more likely to diagnose certain what's the word, disorders,
Yeah, the
they
symptoms.
look on the surface level of
Yeah.
what's the behavior, and then let's see a checklist and say, oh, that's this disorder, this disorder, it's this disorder. But I believe it all stems from trauma. That's my personal opinion. And the more I learn, I mean, I'm open to it being wrong, but the more I learn, the more I feel that's validated.
Yeah, my and another way to put that is that it all stems from some misunderstanding of oneself and a misbelief in oneself, a lack belief or a core belief that is out of alignment with the reality of things and with the truth of who we are, basically, and that does, yeah, create some kind of splitting from wholeness to being incomplete or in lack. So yeah, that's a powerful um, acknowledgement. And I want to add something around, you know, what I've observed is, like you said, in the Western civilization, a lot of the time we focus on the surface level and we don't necessarily go to the root of things. And if we want to really heal, if we want to really emerge and find out at the very core of who we are, we need to go to the depths of things. And that requires that we begin to not only asking the question of what, but why. What, why, and also how, with openness, non judgmentality, love. And if we work with people, let's say we have a therapist or psychologist, in order for any person to be able to hold space and guide an exploration for any individual, it requires that they themselves have done some inner work, or else they will be limited to what they themselves haven't worked through yet. So there are certain individuals. I just want to mention one. His name is Gabor Mate. He's a real expert on trauma and wounding and also addiction. And there is so much one can learn from him. I've learned a lot from him. So I just wanted to bring that into this space. And yeah, I give the mic to you, brother, as if you have anything to respond to that.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's funny. Yeah, because I've known of Gabor Mate for a while, and I've actually just bought his course, which should be interesting to dive into over the coming months. But yeah, what I was thinking was, we talked a little bit about trauma being linked to a lack of unconditional acceptance and unconditional love.
Yeah.
Like if you're when you're experience war or whatever, that's not in an environment of unconditional love and acceptance. When you experience being bullied, or when you experience a parent berating you, judging you, that is not in the kind of, that's not being given with unconditional love.
Mm.
So that when you're looking to heal, what I've realized is that you almost need to learn to, because often we're looking outside of ourselves for acceptance, for validation. Okay, I feel like my worth is dependent on certain factors. You know, I have worth if I am wealthy, you know, so I'll get a mansion. Okay, brilliant. Well,
Mm,
then other people have still got more than me. So I feel that sense of lack. Oh, I need another mansion. I need another car. I need more, 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 more to
mm,
fill that sense of lack within. Um, so what you and yeah, if you look outside of yourself for that validation, for that acceptance, and for that love, you're always going to fall short, and it's never going to meet your expectations. Or if it does, and then it's removed from you, then you're going to feel a lot of lack after that. It's just going to illuminate the lack that's always been there.
mm,
So the way to really work towards healing trauma and integrating different parts of yourself is to create the conditions of unconditional love and unconditional acceptance within yourself for
mm.
yourself.
Yeah.
So if you reconnect to, say, the part of yourself that was experienced trauma when you were 5 because your parents divorced and because you felt like you weren't heard and you felt like no one would listen to you and no one cared about what you thought. If you somehow reconnect with that part of yourself that's 5 years old and give that part of yourself the love and unconditional acceptance that was lacking in that time, then that reintegrates that part of yourself that's in some way been having that need and that lack for however many years, decade, it could be decades.
Mm,
There's still an aspect of your being that's craving acceptance and love.
mm,
So you, what I say to a lot of my clients is you might almost need to become kind of a almost like a father figure or a mother figure for your own inner children and your own inner selves, and
mm,
be that balance between strong and sensitive, you know, that all healthy balanced parents embody.
mm,
And that's just a way of like visualizing that for the work you have to do for yourself, so you're not a victim, kind of like, you know, powerless to work through your trauma,
mm.
but you're also not seeking something from someone outside of yourself. You know,
Mm,
you're empowering yourself and doing the work for yourself.
mm.
And that's quite yeah, an amazing process.
Profound process. And it's a process of getting to the point where we have the tools and the resources to do that work on our own. So, as you speak to, you know, having a counselor, having a mentor can be so enriching in really accelerating our growth and also gaining some tools and some resources and an orientation that progressively heals us and progressively actually supports our blooming, that supports our emergence. And my view is that we all need help. We all need support. We all need guidance. We're interconnected and we're all resources for each other. So, this is something I hold deeply, and I'm so grateful for all the mentors that I've had and how we serve each other. You know, the many conversations I've had with you about things that's been coming up for me, and vice versa, the work that we've been doing together. So, just linking this to trauma, um, I feel, or my experience is going back to what I said earlier about the question why. Let me give an example. So, as human beings, one thing that is quite prominent nowadays is stress, anxiety, overthinking, and all of this will degrade and diminish our well being. Initially, like in the Western civilization, one way to treat that is through medication, which numbs us, which makes us dull usually, and it's not the ideal way to work with things. Sometimes it is really helpful. Let's say you have ADHD, medication can actually be quite useful with certain conditions. As far as I know, I can't speak from my own experience, but I am open to the fact that medication has its place in our society if it's administered in a holistic kind of way. Having said that, let's say one has an addiction to weed, for instance, or an addiction to alcohol. Usually, if you trace that, if you track that addiction, it is basically solving a problem for you. It is giving you some kind of like a balm on you, or some kind of relief that that you're actually seeking, because within yourself there is some level of suffering, there is some level of emptiness, or some kind of deficiency that is not being met by outside, or outside that addiction to weed or to alcohol. And that's how really addictions plays a role. But then if you ask, why are you addicted in the first place? And okay, you find out, okay, I'm suffering, but what is that wound about? Why, where does that originate in? And as we trace back, then naturally we move further and closer to the root, and that's where the real healing can begin, as you were speaking to.
Yeah, definitely. Because you could look at someone who's an alcoholic and you could say, look, alcohol's ruining your life. This is happening because of your alcohol. You've lost your family, you've lost this and that. Why don't you just give up? But there's a reason why they can't. Is because that alcohol will be serving a certain function.
Yeah.
If they've got a lot of post-traumatic stress, and alcohol is something that numbs it and helps them like not feel anymore, then they're going to rely on it. you know and the way to work with that is not to say, oh, you should just stop giving up alcohol, why don't you? It's to say, okay, well, what why do you rely on alcohol? What function is it serving? Okay, that's good to understand that. And then can we like co-create a healthier way to fulfill that same function? So if the function is to calm down, can you try meditation? Can you try exercise and then meditation afterwards?
Yeah.
Something like that. Or if that doesn't work, you say, well, why is the need to calm down there in the first place? Why is the anxiety there? Why is there post-traumatic stress? What's at the root of that? Let's trace that back. Let's look at, oh, you had a really troubling childhood, and this and this happened, and you haven't yet processed that trauma.
Mm.
Okay, well, you're not going to let go of your anxieties and your post-traumatic stress unless you address the trauma and the all that pent-up energy in the nervous system that's never quite been dispelled.
Mm. 100%, 100%. And actually, if we're using the word trauma quite a lot, and actually it originated in Greece. It's a Greek word originally, and it actually translates to wound as well.
Mm.
So it's like an inner wound. And like I said, back in the day, people talked to me about trauma and wounds. I was like, I don't have any wounds.
Mm.
I really thought that, because, on some level, I was quite a buoyant person and happy. Like, how do happy? We use the word happy like it's candy, but over on the surface, at least, I felt like things were together. But as I was diving in, became aware of multiple wounds that was in me, and that I had to work with and process. And to be frank, I'm just going to say straight up that after having worked through like a lot of that wounding, I've accessed a different level of fulfillment and happiness that is
Mm.
on a completely different level, dimension of the like the limited happiness that I experienced before then. So I think it's quite useful to conceive of this in this context, because one thing that I observe is like people can be quite become quite like get stuck in a comfort zone, and basically justifying their way of living as like, this is good, like I feel good here and there, I have good friends. But my encouragement is to really, like, there is always more. There is always more. So if you don't find yourself to be on a track of being, of constant transformation, of constant, like being in a process, in a flow of insight, of greater self-understanding, then you've basically to a certain extent calcified, and that will basically put you in a situation, in a context where you're basically going in circles, and eventually one will have to wake up to that fact or continue in that for eternity.
Yeah, that comes up, brings something up for me. Is like people have asked me like, why are you looking into stuff that happened when you're a kid? Like, what's the point? Like, why would I want to disturb my equilibrium and reconnect with past traumas? Like, that's in the past. That I want to forget about that. You know, I've got it in a little comfortable box. Basically, I've repressed that, and I don't want to touch it anymore. It's too painful. And then when I share that I invite that and I want to experience that and work through it, they're like, well, why the fuck would you do that? Like, that's so alien to me. Like, you know, you're mental. And then someone asked me the other day why I do it. And I have been thinking on this. It's like, the more I shed, you know, the more I let go, the more I process that I often don't even know is there, you know, because it's somewhere deep in my subconscious. Like, you know, from the work I've done with you and the work I've done with other practitioners, um, the more I let go of, the more joy I feel just with being,
Mm,
you know, because so much of our happiness is derived from what we do or what we experience. So
mm,
when I eat food, oh, it tastes good, I feel good. You know, when I'm having a laugh with mates, you know, I feel happy, I feel good.
mm,
When all the stimulation is taken away and you're just sitting with yourself, you're just like, well, fuck, I feel like shit. I feel bored. I feel empty. What the
mm,
fuck am I doing?
mm.
Like, do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So the more I process this stuff, the more I'm just content with being. And that's not an invitation to just be a lazy bastard and just sit on your ass feeling joyful all the time, you know? Like, it's not like that. It's but the actions you do come more from a place of joy and wholeness rather than like emptiness and deficiency. So I'm looking for something to make me feel good, you know, like I'm looking for something to stimulate me, you know, and that's where addiction comes from. So yeah, over the years my tendencies have been less addictive. You know, there's still stuff I'm working on, definitely, especially with like with food, you
Mm,
know. Once I get going with some sweet food, it's you know, it's hard to, I find it hard to stop, you know. So there's a lot of stuff, yeah, connected to childhood about food, you know, stuff like the associations with happiness, you know, like yeah, loads of different things, you know, you know, all these cultural norms of like, yeah, you finish what's on your plate, yeah,
yeah.
you get your fair share, all of these like different programs and different ideas around food that are so deeply woven into my way of being and probably other people's way of being.
Mm,
um so yeah, there's still work to do, you know, even when you've been kind of trying to learn and grow for many years, there's always work to do. You
mm,
know, there's never the finished article. It's a dynamic process, and it's a way of life. And I would say the juice is worth the squeeze. You know,
mhm.
the effort you put in to let going of past trauma and for like inquiring, and yeah, it is effort, but it's worth it. Like,
One shift that I've observed in me that's such a powerful shift is that eventually, like the orientation that has deepened for me is that I love truth. I love to be authentic. I love to be real. And I love that more than comfort. I love that more than having overarching. Of course, you know, I'm just saying as an overarching, overriding theme is that there is a love for truth. So, if the truth of my situation is that I have trauma in my childhood, I'm actually interested because I want to know myself. I want to know the truth of my situation. So growth and evolution, progression is a natural process embedded in the actual nature of life. So when we're not moving progressively like that, something is actually blocked. And when we begin to really unlock that the true love that we have for being real and being intimate and enrichment and progressively learning more about the universe, expanding in our sense of self, evolution becomes natural. It becomes second nature. And that's when another level of the human condition, I feel like, is actualized. I'm speaking from my own experience here.
Mm.
So my what I encourage is, with this conversation here, self-realization, self-actualization for is possible for every human being. Every individual has the possibility to unlock their full potential, whatever that is. So, but the question is, are we oriented in that? Are we wishing for that? Are we cultivating that? And have we really discovered that in ourselves? Because I believe that is an innate drive that is either dormant or it's active. And if it's active, how active is it?
Yeah, it makes me think of like an example of myself and my own kind of journey of self growth, and like looking back to my behaviors when I was younger, particularly in my teens and early 20s, was like there was two different types of my character and personalities that did not fit. They didn't align at all. Like one of them was to be like a really kind, sensitive, like loving person, like caring for people, always wanting to make people happy and like make people feel good about themselves. And the other part was being like quite a big like piss taker and like quite socially obnoxious, would you call it, like a bit of a shit, gobshite. Like, yeah,
Yeah.
there's loads of different words you could use, and I've been called many, but I didn't really understand it that much when I was younger, and I used to get quite down because I'd wake up in the morning after a night out and be like, oh fuck, who have I offended? Like who do I have to apologize to? And I genuinely felt really bad because I was like, fuck, I really like hurt that person's feelings, like, just talking shit but with a completely straight face, just like like saying absolutely ridiculous things. And tracing that back, it's like, well, why did I do that? Why was I a piss taker? What function did that serve? And I traced that back to, yeah, my childhood. And I grew up in an environment that there was a very, very big piss taking culture. Like my dad had a big family. We were always getting like teased and stuff, and always like being made fun of, but in a like a kind, in a, not like a bullying way, but in like fairly brutal. And then at school as well, there was name calling, there was all this stuff, and I hated it. I hated people taking the piss out of me. I hated feeling ashamed and feeling like people were laughing at me. So I created an armor, like a verbal psychological armor, not only armor but also weaponry.
Yeah.
To like, I realized the best form of defense was attack.
Yeah.
And if I had a sharp tongue and I was feeling insecure in a social situation, if I was the one taking the piss, then no one was going to take the piss out of me.
Mm.
So this characteristic formed and become part of my character. It's just this kind of like gobshite piss taker. Not in every situation,
Ah.
but especially in like lad groups and social situations. And there's a big culture of it. And yeah, when I realized that, it took me a while to separate, to realize actually the core part of myself is actually to be kind and to like help people. So I was like, well, why am I still drinking, and why am I still behaving like this? Again, because the alcohol was serving a function. The alcohol was covering up from an inner lack I felt.
Mm.
And when I was drinking, I'd slip into that mode of feeling insecure and then starting taking the piss, So the more work I did on myself, the more I felt okay with myself, the more I accepted myself, the more I felt like I don't need to hang around in these groups. I don't need to take the piss. It's
Mm.
not necessary. I can just be myself and be nice. And like, I distance myself from those types of cultures and the people that would would somehow, I'd be more likely to draw that side of myself
Mm.
from. And now I rarely drink, if ever. And yeah, I don't think in my knowledge, offended anyone for probably a fair few months,
Yeah.
maybe, maybe even years. You'll have to ask my friends.
You can ask me. Jokes. Yeah, you're a good
I'm
man.
still a bit of a piss taker, but it's all with love.
Yeah, it's all with love. It's all with love, and I'm happy that you brought that on because as we expand and go beyond this shell of protection, which includes weaponry, ammunition, it includes attack, we become natural. We become spontaneous, which includes playfulness, which includes joy, and sometimes it is appropriate to take a piss. You know what I mean? Sometimes it is appropriate to take a piss. If you are
take
honestly,
take the piss, not take a piss. But you're right; it is
yeah,
sometimes appropriate to take a piss.
yeah, to take the piss,
You mean take the piss? Yeah,
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 to
yeah.
take that piss is sometimes appropriate because when you do it with me, like I'm there. I'm up for it. You know what I mean? I think it's a fun kind of thing. Of course, I feel this the word appropriate is quite relevant in this context because in a certain context it's absolutely inappropriate to take the piss. Other
Definitely.
times it is, you're just having a good one with friends or mates or whatever, or you meet someone in the street who's just on the same wavelength. You take the piss and you know that it doesn't carry any form of negativity, any form of negative energy. Is having a good time, is having a fun, is exploring the possibilities of being human, and you're knocking one out. You know what I mean? And then
Knocking one out, taking a piss. What is this?
jokes, jokes. Me and Tim yesterday we were talking, and I usually play around with that word. It can have multiple meanings, can't it? In England.
Still perfecting your English,
Yeah.
brother. You got more of a kind of American thing going on, but with time,
Yeah, with time. I'm originally from Norway, Oslo, and I've been traveling quite a lot, so I've been extracting certain languages or certain English here, certain English from there, this, that, and the other.
that's good. It's good, man. You speak another language. Most of us Brits are quite pathetic at languages. So, yeah, I admire anyone who puts the effort into learning another language.
So basically, wheeling it back in. Um, One thing I feel is quite a powerful consideration is this perception of acknowledgement, basically acknowledging our situation. Simply, this has been a big one for me, and I feel it involves like equality of acceptance and forgiveness and really coming in touch with ourselves and being sensitive to ourselves and also connecting with the innocence of every human being. I feel inherently every human being has an element of innocence. I don't believe that any human being is inherently evil. I believe every human beings are inherently good, and that if we peel away the layers of patterning, of conditioning, of hurt, of fear, what is left is a diamond of goodness. This is my direct personal belief and experience, observation, after having worked with people and also dived into myself. So, yeah, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I think it'd be worth talking like what was coming up for me when you said that is like what's going to block people healing from trauma ultimately, for everyone to healing and like integrating the different parts of themselves. And I think one of the main things is this kind of like role of victimhood, you know
Mm.
um if you've experienced trauma and you were in the role of the victim, you know, you can carry that role with you and think, yeah, life just happens to me. You know, this, and this happened to me.
Mm.
Life will always be shit. I'll always get bad luck. You know, people will always take advantage of me, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. You
Mm.
know, and you end up perpetuating the cycles. You know, someone that was, for example, abused in childhood will often be re-abused in adulthood, you know,
Mm.
and that's not their fault. It's not a conscious thing that they're inviting it in. But when you carry that sense of victimhood with you, inevitably you attract perpetrators that will um, take advantage of those insecurities and the lack of boundaries.
Mm. Yeah, I want to add, in addition to what you said, victimhood, which we can touch on, go deeper. I also want to add complacency and inertia is also a big thing. Lack of motivation, and that
Mm,
we get very comfortable and get kind of stuck in our habits and in our point of view. So we close down and we seek to simply continue our existence instead of blossom into the unknown. We seek to perpetuate the known versus blossoming into the unknown and turning life into a real adventure and really seizing the day every day, seizing the day, seizing the opportunity of life for a constant perpetual expansion in all directions. So if we want to touch on victimhood, one thing I want to emphasize there is the difference between victimization and victimhood, because it is true that all of us at some point in our lives have been victims, probably victims to certain happenings in our life. For instance, if we're bullied, we're actually in that context we are a victim of being bullied. However, what does not happen is if that becomes an identity,
mm,
and then it turns into victimhood, where you are identified with being a victim, and on some level, then you will continue attracting that context of being a victim, and you also believe yourself to be a victim, and what you believe yourself to be you will project out into the world, and that will attract other people that believe themselves to be, let's say, superior, or to be dominant in some ways, because that's a match. That's a pattern match. If you think about the jigsaw puzzle, that's a perfect match. But if you're full of vigor, full of love, you don't take bullshit, you're not going to attract a perpetrator, because if a perpetrator comes into your field, you're gonna fend them off quite naturally, because you don't, first of all, you have nothing for them to plug into, and then second of all, there is a power in your energy field. There is its confidence that, like, you're full, like you're whole. You don't take that fucking bullshit.
I think when you say that, you know, kind of looking at victimhood and why these kind of these roles perpetuate, and what kind of leads to these feelings being felt, you know, because I think some people don't often understand, like, you know, this thing happened when I was bloody 2 years old. How can I still be feeling it now? How can I have not gotten over it yet?
Yeah.
And yeah, I think it's important to kind of look at the kind of physiology of trauma, and I read
Biology.
and the biology, yeah, and the
Mm.
psychology. So I read a really interesting book called Waking the Tiger by Peter Levine, and that's where I kind of, yeah, helped me kind of dive into trauma and understanding it. And from what I learned from his book, um, so when you experience some kind of threat, you know, in the wild, that would be like, I don't know, like some kind of wild animal trying to attack you, you would experience a reaction in your nervous system. You know, you would go into fight or flight mode, as they say, which would increase your heart rate so you can pump fresh oxygen around the body. You know, the body, there'd be like more oxygen to the muscles, your breathing would increase, you know, your digestion would switch off, your immune system would switch off. So you're essentially ready for action. You're ready to defend yourself, to defend your life,
Can
you
I
know.
add something there? Another
Sure.
thing that happens is that the energy and the blood moves from the frontal cortex and more back into the move more towards the primal brain, so we can act more impulsively and quicker. But that also takes away from our creativity and our free will to take, balanced, you could say, calm choices, and also there's a lot of cortisol and adrenaline that is
Mm,
created and pumped into the muscles
mm,
so that we get on the alert, so we're
yeah.
super alert, we're present.
Mm,
This
mm,
is when the sympathetic nervous system turns on, and we're in a condition of high alertness. And today stress is a fucking big thing, and many people are living in stress with the sympathetic nervous system active many much of the day, which is obviously not healthy. I want to invite you to keep going on your thread before diving into that.
yeah, thanks. So yeah, so when you experience fight or flight mode and you've got all these hormones going, you know, you've got the energy in the nervous system which helps power this kind of reaction in the body. If you then fight your way out of a situation or you run away, then that helps kind of discharge all that energy in the nervous system, and it helps you let go, you know, it helps you process.
Mm,
Whereas if you go into the freeze response, which is literally you're so shit scared that you just freeze, you know, you almost dissociate, you know, some part of your awareness just goes away from the present moment. And that happens with rape victims sometimes, or it could even happen if, you know, like in the woods, you just saw like a massive bear, you literally just like frozen.
mm,
So if you stay in that frozen state and you don't let the body kind of go through its natural process of dispelling the energetic charge of the nervous system, you know,
mm,
because if you run, you help dispel it. If you fight, you help dispel it. If you shake, you know, you find a trauma sufferer might shake after the trauma.
mm,
That's a good thing. That's the body discharging this energy. You know,
mm,
if you were to stop that process,
mm,
it means that that would stay into inside you, which becomes post-traumatic stress,
mm.
and that just builds up, and that I believe is what leads to anxiety in the future. It's just that post-traumatic stress.
Yeah.
uh, so what knowing that, you can seek to do things to help you reconnect with that with that nervous energy and to discharge it. And there's certain therapies like I can't remember what it's called, but one of them is like, and they use it with war veterans, is they encourage people to like shake their body, and the shaking kind of allows the body to release the trauma. And
Another
there's
thing is,
also
yeah.
the somatic processing, which is like, yeah, again, using the body to let go of that trauma, because
Mm,
it's all contained within the body, you know, emotions and nervous energy, it's all within the body. So if you try and work through trauma purely in the head
mm,
without getting the body involved,
yeah.
it doesn't always, and often doesn't, get to the allow you to process
And access it all. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and access it all. Yeah,
I feel, there are other, of course, breath work is super powerful here.
yeah,
Reading breath
yeah.
work is a very powerful modality and technique for
Mm,
healing and releasing trauma.
mm,
The thing that I wanted to say and mention here is, um, yeah, so when we have a traumatic incident happen, what happens is, um, our neurons begins to forms into a pattern in our brain, and when that pattern crystallizes, that become like a neurological circuitry that is really actually embedded in our brain.
Mm.
As we go back to that memory, that neurological circuitry will activate and keep on firing again and again. And for every time it fires, it creates the same chemical reaction in our body, which then, of course, is what emotion is. So, if that experience was highly traumatic for us, and we had feelings of and emotions of shame come up, a sense of being scared, feelings of hurt, etc., etc. As we go back to that memory and we're continuously reactivating that memory, which I said, like I said, is a neural network in our brain now, then we will continue to recreate that situation, which will create stress for us in present time,
Mm.
and that will debilitate us. And again, like you said, we contain that nervous energy in our system, which creates or makes us overthink. It makes us anxious. It makes us fearful and scared, even though there is no reason for it, because we're constantly carrying the past with us in the present. And there is ways and modalities to recreate, rewire our brains in ways that promotes happiness, that promotes well-being, joy. And this comes, on a psychological level, this is interlinked with the narrative and the story we tell about the world and we tell about ourselves, which again, of course, links deeply to our core beliefs about who we are, what we can be, what we cannot be. And the process that me and Tim is speaking to here is all about liberating ourselves from all these unconscious narratives, and also basically recreating our body, our brain, in a way that is truly wholesome, optimized, and progressive, and really in alignment with well-being, happiness, joy, etc.
Yeah, what was coming up for me that I think would be an interesting thing to mention and discuss is associative conditioning. You know, how if you experience a trauma and there was other things going on at the same time, they
Yeah,
can be fused into the trauma and they can provide triggers later on.
yeah,
If you were in war, and there was like obviously the trauma of seeing people dying and being in that kind of like survival mode, and there was like a lot of loud noises going off.
yeah,
If you're then now, you know, kind of like back home with your family and a firework goes off, the body's response is associating loud sounds with survival and with that fight or flight mode. So all the feelings, all the hormones, all the stress, you know, will be caused from just a firework going off, you know, because of the associations.
yeah,
But the associations can also be, you know, not just from something like a war veteran, someone. It can also be things like, say, for example, you were witnessing your dad beating your mum, or you know, some kind of domestic violence, and as you were looking at them, you know, you were very fearful, and then you know, you looked at a spider at the same time. There was a spider in the room, you know.
yeah,
You would fuse that feeling you felt about your parents with the experience of the spider. So
yeah,
later on, years later, you might have a what's the word, a kind of yeah, like a what's the kind of we call them irrational fears
ah,
of a spider. What did you say? Sorry.
no, never mind.
No, there is a word for it, but I just can't think of it.
Yeah, I don't think I was on point with the word that I was
Okay. But
conjuring.
say, yeah, you've got irrational fears of spiders. You know, you say it's irrational, but then if you trace it back, you might actually realize that it's because it's fused with, when you look at a spider, you're reminded of that feeling you got, that fear
Yeah,
of your parents arguing. And that can translate to so many different things, that the way the brain fuses things together in a time of heightened
yeah.
sensitivity, and your heightened sense, you know, when you're in survival mode, there's a heightened sensitivity because survival's at stake.
Great point. Great point. Great point. And I want to bring out and highlight the word trigger that you were using. So
Mhm.
basically, the spider, when you observe this spider in your field of awareness, it basically triggers a response in your body because your brain interprets the information and then links it with a memory from the past that was highly traumatic, and then will recreate that original situation. Although, if you were to see that from a bird's eye view, there's literally no threat in the environment at all, but the past is being recreated because the past experience has not been metabolized, it hasn't been worked through, and it's still being carried in the same way that it occurred. So that's where emotional processing comes in, and also where processing as a whole comes in. I want to, before we go deeper into that, possibly another powerful thing I want to, for which can for some people be some words of empowerment, is as we do the work of I've observed this so many times. When we do work on ourselves, we're also doing work for our family. And when
Mm.
we solve something in ourselves, magically it gets to a certain extent, to different extents, solved for other people, and they will actually be liberated from that same pattern. So it's quite powerful how we are in interconnection, and particularly with our family, there is some kind of pact naturally as we grow up. Not to say that we need to stay in touch with our sister if we don't get along with her, or our brother, or there is always room to step out of that family. I'm not saying that that's a rigid phenomena, but usually as we clear up in our own patterns, we're actually doing a great service for our family tree and for our ancestry. And my sense is that whenever we do that, like, our ancestors is celebrating for real.
Yeah. I think the impact that, again, when you're looking at things from a perspective of the whole, like no behavior happens in isolation to the others around you. So the more work you do on yourself and the more you grow, that has a ripple effect on people around you. And I think early out on this kind of path of like self-development, I think the immature way to influence others is to say, look, you've got to do this, you've got to meditate, you've got to eat healthy, you should be doing this, you should be doing that. Whereas with time, you realize that just being the change you seek is the best approach. When you like learn and grow and become a better part of yourself, or a better, you become a better version of yourself, that people recognize that, and if they want to learn what helped you get there, then they'll ask you.
Mm.
If they want to learn and grow, they'll come to you in their own time, in their own way. You don't need to force feed your own beliefs and agendas and experiences on others if they're not ready to listen to them at that time, or if ever. So that's something that I've learned over the years and I've been able to implement more recently. But again, that's a work in progress.
Yeah, and one note on that is, as we raise our vibration, our peer group will have to relate to us from that vibration, not the other vibration, unless we drop down and we habitually go back to our old self, you could say, because we can't maintain, or maintain that pressure people can put on us to drag us back down. So that is a possibility for us all to really step into that new vibration. And what that requires is that there is a shift of identity. Because if we're still identified to a certain extent with that old self, whenever we then step into that new context, we will quite likely also be that same person that we've always been, which can be frustrating, particularly if we've been doing a lot of work and we get back to an old environment, and then suddenly we're the same old, and we're not really happy about that.
Also, when you're developing yourself and you go back and see people that you've known for a long time and you're behaving in a different way and sharing different experiences and different insights and different ways of being,
Yeah,
that can be viewed as a threat by people that are close to you. you
yeah,
know if you say, for example, come back and like, yeah, I'm a vegan now, not that I think, not, I don't have any very strong opinions on that of what people should or shouldn't be doing, but someone that has had a culture of eating meat for a long time, if you go back home and you say to your dad or your mum, yeah, I'm not eating, I'm only eating vegan food now, and their main staple of food is meat, and that's part of their culture and their way of being, they might see that as a threat and say, well, why are you doing that? What's wrong? So in you saying you don't want meat, in a way, you're challenging my choices and saying that what I'm doing is wrong. And that makes me feel insecure. So I'm going to challenge you and say, no, veganism's fucking stupid. You're not, there's no vegans allowed in my household. You eat meat or you go hungry, and have quite a kind of combative approach to it, because it's viewed as threatening, a different
Comes a trigger.
way of being becomes a trigger. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, tying it back to what we said earlier, that you then becoming a vegan triggers that person in their inconsistency within themselves. If they're not safe and content within themselves, then they will be triggered, or insecure rather. That's the right word. If they're insecure within themselves, someone else changing, transforming, mirroring them in a different way will then trigger that insecurity. And if they are mature in their ways, they will take responsibility for that trigger within themselves and inquire, or like, oh, I'm getting insecure here. What is that pointing to? Or, the immature way of reacting to that is by lashing out or becoming very defensive, or becoming very negative and aggressive, for instance.
Mm.
I just want to tie this in as we're speaking about food, exercise, and um, some other things that you mentioned. Without, neither me or Tim have the approach of telling people what to do. We can give suggestions of practices that might be useful and that we know historically leads to a certain outcome. But fundamentally, what I encourage people to do is not primarily to force yourself into action, but to educate yourself. If you educate yourself, then naturally you want to make the transformation. If you're a cigarette smoker, initially when cigarettes came out, nobody knew of the real ill effects of cigarettes. It was after some time of research that people realized, whoa, fuck, this is highly unhealthy actually. So when people got educated as to what are the actual outcomes and effects of smoking cigarettes, naturally you get repelled by it. So one of our tendencies can be to avoid educating ourselves as a way to escape the truth, because we want to maintain that comfort zone and we want to maintain that behavior. But if you actually dive into cigarette smoking and you see the impact on the environment, the impact on your body, the impact on the health care, how that is actually collectively also leading to you know that other people basically need to put more money into healthcare so that we can take care of people who smoke cigarettes, because they will have a degraded health, because we're a collective. So if we look and actually educate ourselves on the effects of cigarette smoking, and we go deep enough, I believe, if we were then rational, this is my point of view, of course we will let go of it, like eventually, at least in any high quantity, because if there is a conscience there, and it's also there is a sense of we're actually oriented towards self-growth, self-development, self-realization, everything that doesn't serve that process we will drop naturally. So education is key, both within nutrition, what we're eating. What we eat, we become is a very common expression. Our body is literally fueled on food. Exercise, finding out, and that's individual as well, like how much and what quality of exercise is most appropriate for your body, for your blueprint. How you spend your time, activities, how you spend your, like, what you put on your body, all these things. Basically, education leads to empowerment. Educate yourself, read, listen to podcasts that gives one information in terms of how to design a lifestyle that supports your process of self-realization, how to form a lifestyle that supports your well-being and your quality of life. This requires education, which again requires time, energy, effort that is in service of your long-term growth and blossoming.
Mm. Yeah, definitely. And then if you have educated yourself, yet you're still falling on the same habits, then it's a good sign to trace that back and find out what function that, whether it's smoking or drinking, find out what function that's serving and find out what's causing that initial need, you know. So that you can kind of work from the bottom up and the top down, educate yourself, do things that support you, but also if there's some blocks, you can work with a counselor, a therapist, a mentor, to do that work. And this actually comes into another point that I was going to mention earlier, is about not um, not taking trauma lightly and not going into it haphazardly, thinking that you're just going to be able to heal it in a week or whatever, heal it quite easily, because I think it's also worth saying that it can be quite unsettling. If your life's quite functional, you got a 9 to 5, you're doing this or that, for you to then trace back and look into your childhood trauma. When you work with trauma, you're incredibly sensitive afterwards. You can't go back to work afterwards. You can't have a counseling session at 9, work with trauma, and then go to work afterwards, because you'd be too sensitive. You
Mm,
might be re-traumatized.
mm,
So you've got to be quite committed and dedicated, and you've got to try and build your life around this work, because if you don't, it can make life, and I've seen it happen. I'm not saying that I wouldn't recommend it in terms of the long process, but in the short term, it can be very unsettling, and it can make it difficult to function in our Western society that's not supportive of this work.
mm.
So I do think it's very important to acknowledge that the facts that our current society, the way it's set up, does not encourage or support this type of work.
Yeah, I think that's great advice and something that we all should consider when we do this work. Of course, every individual is different. So some people would be completely fine going to work afterwards. Other people will be highly sensitive. So it depends from individual to individual. So this is where self-awareness comes into the picture. You know yourself best. So find out what works for you, how does it impact you, look at your experience, how sensitive and how open do you become. For most people, like a general rule is that they become, like Tim says, highly sensitive. So, nourishing yourself, giving yourself space to process
Mm.
is essential really after such processes. So navigating and designing a lifestyle again, designing your days in intelligent ways, skillful ways that which promotes growth and feels wholesome and gives you the space and time that you need to go through what you need to go through. And finally, on that, intuition is a powerful ally in that. Intuitive gut feeling as well. Gut feeling, intelligence, or the intellect of the mind, and intuition of the heart. Be in touch. And that's where, this is a topic for another day where me and Tim can dive more into the three major energy centers of the body, the belly, heart, and head, and how we can begin to unlock those centers and really come into our power. It's really essential to come into full alignment and really attain a sense of completeness within ourselves. We really need to develop these energy centers, unblock them, and synchronize them, and that will unlock some tremendous power within us to really live life powerfully with love, in connection, and with a sense of clarity, and much more. Actually, that's not exhaustive.
Yeah, and I think for anyone considering doing this type of work, I think one of the most important things is to, yeah, is to maybe, as you said, educate yourself. There's some really great books and resources on trauma. Um, I've written a couple, or I've written an article. I don't know if you've written some things as well, Wazee,
Yeah,
on my website. Bit of a plug here, wellbeingmentors.com.
yeah,
Um, and I think when you work with it, it's not something to be done alone, because you need to be very sensitive of being re-traumatized. It's really advised to work with someone who is trauma informed. Whether that's a counselor, a mentor, a therapist, any type of healer, or you know whatever discipline. It doesn't really, the awareness and sensitivity and knowledge of the practitioner is key,
yeah,
and being drawn to a practitioner that feels resonant for you, and you feel safe, secure, comfortable in their presence, because you're going to trust your vulnerable the most vulnerable parts of yourself with them. So you need to feel safe in
yeah.
their space, and they need to hold the space for you, so you can learn to hold the space for yourself.
Mm.
Until you've learned to hold the space for yourself, which is not to get identified with the feelings of the past, and just to be able to witness them and allow the process to work through you. Until you can do that, which takes a lot of time to develop,
Mm.
you need someone to work with. And there are a lot more people that are becoming trauma informed, and me and you being, a couple of them.
Yeah, so thank you for sharing that. So both me and Tim function as mentors, like Tim was saying. He has a website, wellbeingmentors.com. I'm also listed on there, and I this is the umbrella of theartofelvolution.org, where also Tim is listed. So if anyone feels called out to reach out to us, we both offer um, an initial discovery session where we will connect and see how the resonance is. What Tim said about safety and feeling resonance is quite crucial with the people you work with, whomever it may be. And yeah, it's been a delightful conversation with Tim, and this is going to be the first of many, I'm sure. So we've dived in, and I feel we've covered some pretty amazing ground.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Wazzy. I felt a bit nervous at first, and yeah, eased into it a little bit. I actually struggle with public speaking, so that knowledge that people are going to listen to it is like brings up like some kind of, not in my head, but some kind of like physiological fear response that,
Mm,
again, is something I'm working on, and I'm sure has roots in childhood, and God knows whatever, whatever happened before. But yeah, I've enjoyed it, and yeah, maybe it'll happen again in the coming months.
yeah, yeah. So yeah, thank you all who tuned in and dialed in and listened to this conversation. We wish you all the best and lots of love. And what else is there to say? Anything?
Nothing at all.
Okay. And so it is said then. Ciao.